When the sign-up sheet for the local charity talent show reached Senator John Neely Kennedy's desk, they chuckled and tossed it aside. It was clearly meant for staff and interns, not a seasoned politician known for his biting commentary. Someone, anonymously and with a wicked sense of humor, scribbled his name under the singing category. The announcement caused ripples of laughter throughout the office. Even John himself played along with the joke, never expecting to go through with it. But as the event drew closer and the flyers started appearing around Capitol Hill, he began to feel a strange tug-knot of embarrassment, but of curiosity. The idea of showing a different side, of challenging everyone's expectations, started to gnaw at him. It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about reminding himself of the boy who used to sing at church back in Zachary, Louisiana. That part of him hadn't died. It had just gone quiet. He walked into the rehearsal room 2 nights before the show with the same self-deprecating grin he wore on the Senate floor. A few aides and interns were already there, practicing skits and dance routines, barely noticing the senator's entrance. When he cleared his throat and asked where he could warm up, a young staffer snorted. "You're really going through with it?" she asked. "I thought it was a joke," he smiled. Most good things start that way. With no accompaniment and no plan, he stood in the middle of the room and began humming an old Willie Nelson tune. The laughter faded. One by one, heads turned. His voice was surprisingly rich, mellow, and perfectly timed. Not powerful like a trained performer's, but warm and full of feeling. By the end of the first verse, the room had gone silent. One intern even put down her phone, genuinely captivated. Word spread fast. By the following morning, whispers about Senator Kennedy's voice floated through committee halls and press briefings. Reporters initially thought it was another political stunt. But those who had heard the rehearsal were adamant. This wasn't satire. It was genuine. Few even suggested he had the makings of a folk singer. Kennedy remained humble, brushing off the praise with his usual homespun metaphors. But deep down, something old had reawakened. Remembered his grandmother teaching hymns, his father clapping along on the porch. It had been decades since he'd allowed that part of himself into public view. Yet now, because of one anonymous prank, he was preparing to step into the spotlight not as a senator, but as John. The man with a song in his chest. The night of the talent show arrived with the buzz of anticipation. Local journalists packed the front row, congressional staffers filled the balcony. It wasn't just a charity event anymore. It had become a spectacle. John waited backstage in a modest black suit, hands folded, lips pursed in quiet thought. A stagehand approached, nervous. "You sure about this, sir?" Kennedy looked up and nodded. "I've faced the Senate. I can face a mic." Name was announced. The applause was tentative, some of it ironic. He took his place under the soft spotlight, adjusted the mic stand, and let the silence linger. Then slowly, he began to sing. A hush fell. The song he chose was an old spiritual, "Wayfaring Stranger." His voice trembled on the first line but grew stronger with every note, echoing with sorrow, history, and grit. By the second verse, the atmosphere had shifted. People stopped checking their phones. Conversations died mid-whisper. Even the most cynical aides were drawn in. Kennedy didn't perform like someone seeking attention. He stood still, eyes closed, singing from a well of experience that politics had never touched. It was raw, real, and deeply moving. Some in the audience wiped tears. Others leaned forward, as if the lyrics were pulling them closer. When he finished, he opened his eyes to a standing ovation, not out of irony or courtesy, but genuine admiration. Cameras flashed, hands clapped wildly, and even political rivals joined in. In that moment, he wasn't Senator Kennedy. He was just a man who sang the truth and moved a room full of skeptics to feel something pure. Backstage, he sat down on a folding chair and exhaled deeply. A production assistant offered him water, visibly shaken. "That was incredible, sir." He nodded politely, still processing the experience. Then his phone buzzed. The video of his performance had already gone viral, shared by staffers and press alike. Overnight, it began trending across social platforms. Memes began flooding in, but not in ridicule. Most expressed shock, awe, and respect. Who knew? One tweet read, "John Kennedy just did what politics couldn't bring people together with a song." He chuckled at that. It wasn't a campaign, not a speech just. A forgotten melody given new life. And that, he realized, might have been the most honest thing he'd done in years. The next morning, reporters ambushed him outside his office. Microphones shoved near his face, cameras clicking. "Senator Kennedy, do you plan to release a recording?" One asked, "Are you considering a music career?" Another joked. He grinned. "Y'all must be hard up for content," he replied in his southern drawl. But privately, the idea didn't seem so far-fetched. Calls started coming in from music producers, TV hosts, even late-night shows. One email subject read, "Kennedy, unplugged, let's talk." Couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. He was still a senator with bills to debate and constituents to serve. Yet somehow, singing one old song had unlocked a door he never knew was still there. And people weren't just listening, they were responding. Something had shifted in. How they saw him, something real. Later that week, he was invited to sing again at a veterans fundraiser. This time, there was no hesitation. He chose Amazing Grace, keeping the arrangement simple. No backup vocals, no guitar, just his voice, and a single spotlight. Again, the crowd responded with reverent silence, then thunderous applause. One elderly vet approached him afterward, tears brimming. "You reminded me of my brother. Used to sing that during the war," he whispered. Hearing you, it brought him back. Kennedy put a hand on the man's shoulder, speechless. That moment lingered far longer than any vote he'd ever cast. He began to realize that music had the power to reach places politics never could. And that maybe, just maybe, this was a path worth exploring. It's not abandoning. Meanwhile, talk shows couldn't stop replaying his performance. Clips were dissected like political debates. Commentators marveled at his unexpected talent. One guest on a morning show said, "It's not just that he can sing, it's that he meant every word." Kennedy watched it all with a mix of amusement and humility. He hadn't planned any of this. But the response forced him to consider a dual identity, part legislator, part balladeer. Invitations came pouring in. Concerts, charity events, even a folk music festival in Kentucky. He turned most of them down, wary of being seen as unserious. But when an invitation arrived from the Library of Congress to perform at a historical music celebration, he paused. This wasn't entertainment. This was legacy. This was preservation. And it stirred something deeper. He accepted the invitation. Choosing to perform 3 traditional Southern ballads rooted in American history, the audience was a blend of scholars, musicians, and cultural historians. As he sang, the room remained hushed, not with surprise this time, but with reverence. They understood the cultural weight of his voice, the lineage behind his phrasing. Afterward, a musicologist approached him. "You carry the cadence of the South in your tone," she said. "It's more than talent. It's inheritance." He didn't know how to respond, but deep down, he knew she was right. His voice wasn't trained, but it was lived. It held decades of trials, triumphs, and the fading rhythms of a region trying to remember itself. For the first time, he felt more than heard. He felt understood. In the weeks that followed, Kennedy found himself juggling Senate hearings by day and rehearsals by night. What started as a light-hearted accident was slowly evolving into a personal renaissance. He wasn't reinventing himself. He was rediscovering a long-lost version that had been buried beneath decades of political armor. One evening, while walking home alone, he passed by a small park where a young girl was strumming a ukulele. He paused and looked up. "You're the singing senator, right?" He smiled and nodded. She asked him to join her for a song. Without hesitation, he sat down on the bench beside her. Together they sang "Take Me Home," "Country Roads," and a small crowd formed. No cameras, no stage, just shared humanity. That impromptu duet was later uploaded by a bystander and gained even more traction than his first performance. People weren't just intrigued, they were inspired. They saw something rare, sincerity without strategy. Soon, universities began, inviting him to speak not about politics, but about the intersection of culture, and authenticity. He delivered guest lectures titled The Power of Vulnerability in Leadership and Why Music Still Matters, while students who had once rolled their eyes at his folksy metaphors now leaned forward in their seats, genuinely engaged. Professors marveled at how seamlessly he blended personal stories with historical insights. One professor of ethics remarked, "It's rare to see someone lead with both conviction and melody." Kennedy wasn't trying to be a celebrity, but he had become something else entirely. A bridge between generations, ideologies, and disciplines. He wasn't just singing, he was healing. The music gave him a new language, one immune to filibusters and sound bites. And in classrooms, that language spoke louder than any floor speech ever could. Inevitably, the political world began to notice and react. Some colleagues applauded his transformation, seeing it as refreshing and humanizing. Others whispered behind closed doors, accusing him of orchestrating a publicity stunt. What's next? One senator sneered, "Album dropped from the Judiciary Committee." But Kennedy didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned into the tension. At one press conference, when asked about the criticism, he replied, "If honesty looks like theater to you, maybe you've forgotten what real looks like." The comment went viral, cementing his status as both rogue and folk hero. Even the president mentioned him in a lighthearted quip during a speech, joking, "If the Senate ever forms a choir, I know who's taking the solo." Kennedy smiled when he heard it. Let them joke. He wasn't chasing applause, he was chasing meaning. As the year drew to a close, he was invited to perform at the Kennedy Center during a gala honoring American storytelling. He hesitated at first. The stakes felt different. This wasn't a hometown fundraiser or a university auditorium, it was a cultural temple. But something inside urged him forward. He chose a song called "Long Time Traveler," a haunting Appalachian tune about memory, distance, and return. The moment he began, the room stilled. His voice wasn't flawless, but it was true. Each word seemed carved from his bones, each note a breath pulled from generations past. When he finished, there was no immediate applause, just a moment of stunned silence. Then came the roar. Even seasoned performers approached him afterwards, shaken. "Hey, you don't perform," one whispered. "You confess." That night, he realized something profound. Music wasn't just a gift. It was a calling. Despite the acclaim, Kennedy remained grounded. Yes. He still took early morning meetings, debated policy, and returned constituents' calls. But now, people treated him differently. They spoke to him, not at him. They asked about his songs before his stances. He wasn't a different man. He was the same man with the volume turned up on his soul. He began organizing local music nights in small towns, places often ignored by national headlines. He'd bring young artists, veterans, and elders together on makeshift stages. They'd sing, swap stories, and build bonds. In one town, a mother hugged him tightly and whispered, "You brought my son out of his shell. He hasn't sung in years." Kennedy nodded, understanding. This wasn't fame, this was fellowship. He saw firsthand how a simple tune could unlock a silent heartland that was power politics could never reach. Then came an unexpected twist. A Grammy nomination. Someone had compiled recordings from his performances, live takes, unrehearsed moments, and submitted them under the category of Best Americana Album. When he first heard, he laughed so hard, he spilled coffee on his tie. "Y'all must be kidding," he said, but it was no joke. The nomination became a media firestorm. Analysts debated whether a sitting senator should be allowed to accept such an award. Social media exploded. Fans rallied. Critics grumbled. Kennedy, ever composed, held a press conference and said, "I didn't plan this, and I won't politicize it. But if a song can make someone feel seen, then I'm proud of that." That honesty disarmed even his harshest skeptics. The Grammys extended the invite, and whether he won or not, the moment had already made history. The night of the Grammy Awards felt surreal. He walked the red carpet in a modest tuxedo, waving politely, still unsure how he'd landed there. Celebrities approached him not out of curiosity, but with genuine praise. One artist, a chart-topping singer-songwriter, hugged him and said, "You reminded me why I started singing." During the ceremony, he sat quietly, hands folded. When his category was announced and another name was called, he stood and applauded sincerely. There was no disappointment or only gratitude. The cameras captured his humble smile. Later, during an interview, he said, "I never sang for awards. I sang because I had something worth remembering." That line echoed across networks. It wasn't just a quote, it was a creed. And for many watching, it became the most memorable moment of the entire night. Back home, the Grammy buzz faded, but the impact lingered. His state held a public celebration in his honor, not for being a politician, but for being real. Sang his songs at school assemblies, local choirs invited him to join them. A mural was painted downtown, showing him mid-song, eyes closed, hand on heart. Kennedy visited it quietly one evening, standing in the shadows. He didn't need recognition, but seeing art born from his vulnerability moved him deeply. That night, he wrote a new song, not for the stage or the cameras, but for himself. It was called "Return to Zachary," a ballad about coming home to one's roots. To the boy who sang before the world asked him to speak, he played it only once, sat a community potluck in his hometown, surrounded by family, friends, and the ghosts of his past, and it felt perfect. The political world kept spinning, but Kennedy had changed. He no longer spoke just to be heard, he spoke to connect. His floor speeches grew more poetic, more intentional. He'd quote song lyrics, reference forgotten folktales, and end with lines that lingered. Some senators mocked it, but others followed suit. Quiet revolution began not of bills, but of tone, civility. Once a relic began to creep back into discourse. It wasn't naive. New songs couldn't erase corruption, but they could soften hearts if only for a moment. And sometimes a moment was all it took. That shift became his quiet legacy. He didn't just serve a term. He stirred a soul. And as the years passed, people wouldn't remember every vote he cast, but they'd remember how he made them feel when he sang. Then tragedy struck. A wildfire tore through a rural town where he had once held a music night. Dozens of homes were lost. Lives were upended. Kennedy flew there immediately, not to give speeches but to help. He rolled up his sleeves, carried supplies, and sat with the grieving. One night at a makeshift shelter, someone handed him a guitar. He hesitated. Then he sang, "You'll Never Walk Alone." Voices joined in, cracked but defiant. People held each other. Tears flowed. On that smoky hall, hope rose from the ashes. Through policy, but through song. And in that moment, Kennedy understood the final truth. Music wasn't an escape. It was a rescue. A bridge across pain. And that night, as the embers glowed outside, he promised himself he'd never stop singing, not for glory, but for grace. In the aftermath of the wildfire, Kennedy's presence became a symbol of steadiness in chaos. News outlets ran footage of him hauling bottled water and comforting families with soft songs under dark skies. One anchor said, "He doesn't show up with platitudes. He shows up with presence." As donations poured in, Kennedy used his influence to direct resources where they were needed most. But beyond logistics, it was his voice that lingered. People who had never cared for politics now quoted his lyrics. Teens covered his songs on TikTok. Grandparents wrote letters thanking him for reminding them that leadership didn't always wear a suit, sometimes carried a guitar. It struck Kennedy deeply. He'd spent years mastering policy, and yet here he was, healing wounds with melodies. He realized that legacy isn't shaped in legislation alone. It's carved into people's memories through moments that matter. And those moments were becoming more frequent. His staff grew to understand that music was now part of the job. From scheduling meetings, they left space for songwriting. His office walls, once lined with charts and maps, now bore framed lyrics and photos of spontaneous performances. On Fridays, he hosted informal sing-alongs open to anyone in the capital who needed a break from cynicism. A janitor once joined him in a soulful rendition of "Stand By Me," and the video went viral. It wasn't an accident. It was a reflection of something bigger. Kennedy was reshaping what it meant to be a public servant. Not with slogans, but with soul. His approval ratings surged, not because of policies, but because of trust. People believed him not just his words, but his intentions. His melodies had stripped away the artifice and exposed something rare in Washington, a heart still willing to feel. Still, he faced pressure. Advisors warned that the music might overshadow his political role. Donors grew uneasy, questioning whether he was still focused on serious issues. But Kennedy remained calm. "What's more serious than reminding people they matter?" he said in one interview. Some pundits called it performative. Others called it genius. But for Kennedy, it was never about perception. It was about purpose. In private moments, he wrestled with doubt, wondering if the duality could last. But then, he'd receive a handwritten note from a student or a voicemail from a grieving parent, thanking him for a song that kept them going. Those moments silenced doubt. They reminded him that leadership doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes, the quietest verse can carry the greatest truth. And so he kept singing even when the cameras turned away. One afternoon, while attending a small-town festival, he was approached by an elderly woman with shaking hands. She held out an old cassette tape. "You sound like my husband did," she whispered. "He passed in '87. I used to play this every night until I couldn't anymore." Kennedy took the tape and listened to it that night in his hotel room. Her voice was gentle, weathered, full of love. He wept. The next day, he played one of the songs at the festival, dedicating it to her. She cried in the front row, mouthing every word. That moment wasn't captured by any news crew, but it didn't need to be. It lived in her heart and in his. That was enough. Kennedy had discovered a different kind of legacy, one not measured in headlines or votes, but in lives. Touched by something real, something timeless. More towns followed. More songs. More moments where silence gave way to something sacred. In Mississippi, he sang with inmates in a prison chapel. In Texas, he played beside a mariachi band in a dusty border town. Each time it was the same. No scripts, no spin, just connection. He didn't try to own the stage, he shared it. And people responded. They opened up, confessed, healed. Music had become a passport to places politics couldn't reach. It didn't matter if the crowd voted blue, red, or not at all. In those moments, they weren't constituents, they were humans. Kennedy learned every town had its own rhythm, its own aching verse, waiting to be sung. And he made it his mission. To listen, to learn, and to sing it back with reverence. 'Cause to him, that was the job now, not just to speak, but to echo what others were too afraid to say. Then came the documentary offer. A renowned filmmaker wanted to chronicle Kennedy's journey, not as a politician, but as a modern troubadour. At first, Kennedy declined. He didn't want his story to be polished for prestige. But after long reflection, he agreed on one condition. No scripts, no reenactments, no narrator. "If it ain't raw, it ain't real," he said. Filming began quietly, capturing his visits, his writing sessions, his quiet pauses between performances. The result was a masterpiece. The Ballad of John Kennedy premiered at Sundance to thunderous applause. Viewers laughed, cried, and stood in silence during the final credits. Critics hailed it as a testimony to the redemptive power of music in a fractured age. Kennedy, watching from the back row, simply smiled. He didn't need the applause. He had already lived the story. With the documentary's success came a new wave of attention. Awards, interviews, even a short stint hosting a segment on NPR about forgotten American folk songs. But Kennedy remained cautious. Fame, he knew, was a fickle tide. He stayed close to his roots, visiting his mother every Sunday, singing at local churches, mentoring young musicians. One such teen, struggling with addiction, told him, "Your songs got me through rehab." Kennedy hugged him, eyes misty. These weren't just fans, they were reminders. Anchors. Proof that when you give the world something real, it echoes in ways you'll never fully understand. That boy went on to start a youth choir, naming it the Wayfarers, after Kennedy's first public song. And so the legacy spread not like wildfire, but like gospel. Quiet, steady, transformative. But not everyone was a fan. A powerful lobbyist once confronted him, sneering, "You're turning politics into a concert hall." Kennedy calmly replied, "And maybe you're turning it into a courtroom, cold, rigid, lifeless." The exchange was caught on a hot mic and went viral. Supporters cheered the clapback. Detractors scoffed. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He wasn't playing to win debates. He was playing to touch souls. And he knew that not everyone would understand. That was okay. It's not every note had to land, but every note had to be honest. That was his rule. And so, he pressed on, even when the applause faded. Because authenticity isn't about being celebrated, it's about being consistent, being real when no one's watching. And in that, Kennedy found peace. Music had become his compass, and he followed wherever it led. He began writing a memoir, reluctantly at first. He titled it Verses from the Hill. Half politics, half poetry, it was a reflection of the man behind the voice. In it, he admitted fears, failures, moments of crippling doubt. But he also shared triumphs, the quiet ones. Veteran, the song sung at a hospice bed. The letter from a girl who said his music stopped her from ending her life. The book sold modestly, but touched deeply. Critics praised its vulnerability. Kennedy didn't do book tours. Instead, he visited libraries and read passages aloud, interspersed with songs. In one town, an entire high school choir surprised him with a harmonized version of Return to Zachary. He cried openly, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of being seen, not as a senator, but as a man. Years passed. Kennedy grew older, his hair whiter, his voice softer, but no less powerful. He no longer chased stages or microphones, they came to him. Young artists sent him songs to review. Choirs invited him to sing one final verse. Awards gathered dust on shelves he barely noticed. What he treasured were the handwritten letters, the old cassette from that woman, the mural downtown. He walked slower now, but with no regret. One morning, while watching the sun rise over the Mississippi River, he strummed his guitar and whispered, "I was never meant to be famous, just useful." That was his truth. His mission had never been to be remembered, had been to remember others, their pain, their joy, their silence. His voice had simply given theirs a home, and that, to him, was the truest measure of a life well lived. When he announced his retirement from the Senate, there was no grand fanfare, just a small press. A conference where he thanked his colleagues, his staff, and the people of Louisiana. "I came here to serve," he said, "and somewhere along the way, I started singing too. I reckon I'll keep doing both, just not from this building." Reporters wept. Not because a politician was leaving, but because a poet was stepping down. That night, across the nation, tributes poured in. Not from lobbyists or think tanks, but from ordinary people. Parents, teachers, veterans, nurses, all of them recounting the time. Kennedy's song found them in a hard moment. He didn't just leave office, he left a chord that would keep ringing. Long after the walls of the Capitol forgot his name, his final public performance was unannounced. A surprise appearance at a community potluck in a flood-damaged town. He walked in with his old guitar, nodded to the small crowd, and sang, "Keep on the sunny side." No lights, no camera crews. It's just a folding chair and a borrowed mic. Kids sat cross-legged, elders swayed gently. When he finished, the room was silent for a beat, then applause erupted. One little girl ran up and hugged him tight. "You sing like my daddy used to," she said. He hugged her back, heart swelling. In that moment, it all came full circle. He had started as a punchline in a talent show and ended as a healing voice in a hurting world. No campaign could have planned it. No poll could have predicted it. It had just happened, like music always does in his final days. Kennedy spent his mornings writing lyrics and his evenings sipping tea on the porch, watching the world soften around him. Visitors still come, young singers, old friends, reporters hoping for one last quote. He gave them all the same thing, a song. Sometimes hummed, sometimes written, sometimes strummed on an out-tuned guitar. One reporter asked what he hoped people would remember most. Kennedy looked out at the setting sun and said, "That I listened, that I felt, and that I answered back in song." It wasn't about legacy. It was about honesty. It's about finding your voice and using it to remind. Others, they still had theirs. That was the lesson he left behind, not in stone or steel, but in song. And songs, he believed, never die. They just wait to be sung again on the day of his passing. People across the country gathered in parks, churches, schools, and living rooms, not to mourn, but to sing. From Louisiana to Oregon, voices lifted into the sky, joining in harmonies built from decades of his truth. The boy from Zachary who once sang in church became a nationwide chorus, and as his guitar was placed gently in the Smithsonian, a plaque was added beneath it. It didn't list his political titles or accolades. It simply read, "He sang so others could breathe." And in every note still echoing from porch radios, school choirs, and open mics, John Neely Kennedy lived on forever, a song in the heart of a nation that finally learned how to listen.